Welcome to the Millennial Reset podcast. Stories of everyday millennials that are redefining success and happiness. Those that have decided to face those subconscious limiting beliefs head on and take the path less traveled to hit reset. Stories that inspire you to take the leap to pursue the passions, dreams, and goals of your inner child and not the expectations of society. If you're new here, welcome. You found your people. I'm your host, Peter Goose, burnt out millennial turned human design and mindset coach, and it's now my mission to create a space to have the conversations out loud around millennial burnout and mindset and inspire and empower my fellow millennial besties to decondition from the programs that keep so many of us stuck and rediscover your most authentic identity, or in other words, the Millennial Reset. And I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Millennial Reset. I see this trend happening lately with more and more of us that we're beginning to kind of rethink and ditch the old paradigm, the short list of career options that are available to us based on our college degree, and instead kind of opening up to the possibility of entrepreneurship and even online entrepreneurship. So super excited for my guest today, Julio, who is the owner of a new startup called Shades, focused on giving us, especially younger adults, a better, more positive way to keep informed of what's going on out there in the world. So many of us get our news from, one source or another, and so often those sources are biased and only tell one side of the story. And so super excited to have Julio on to share a little bit about the mission and vision with what he's doing with this new app. So Julio, thanks so much for coming on and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. So let's dig right into things, Julio. I want to kind of turn the mic over to you and tell the audience a little bit about what you're doing with this new app, Shades, what it's all about, the mission and vision.
Sure. So Shades is a new app that aims to help you understand the issues that are going on in the world by giving you quick summaries of the different points of view on that issue. And so by an act of almost connecting the dots or echolocation or triangulation or whichever metaphor you want to use, recognizing that the issues that we're dealing with today, even if we're not looking at it across more traditional left versus right, this generation versus this generation, just that even before we get there, the issues of the day are so complicated and so nuanced, and there's so much information online that there has to be a better way of really quickly leveraging all of that information that the internet unlocked for us. And for me, it really, it got started. One of my co-founders is my wife, who during the pandemic really ran into this issue like so many of us did, where if we read about a particular issue in one publication and just left it there, we would think one thing about it. And if we just read a different thing, a different publication, we might have a very different point of view on it. Yeah. And that if we were just trusting the algorithms that are increasingly feeding us information, we know that they're really engineered to validate a point of view that it thinks that we already have, or to provoke us by presenting an inflammatory perspective on the opposite of that point of view. And that really there was no mechanism to more neutrally, in a more positive way, simply get a scan, get a summary of what's going on out there in the world. And so we created Shades. So Shades right now, whether it's TikTok memes, hard news, international issues, sports, pop culture, really anything that is interesting to people, anything that would be covered in either TikTok or Wikipedia is equalized in a way in the app. And that, like a TikTok, you're just swiping from one tile to the next and over time, it does learn, let's say, topics. If I'm not interested in parenting topics or something like that, then probably we'll stop giving you that type of content. But one thing that we don't ever do is to edit the points of view that you receive based on any perception that we might have about your political or personal leaning.
Yeah. Wow, that is that's pretty powerful. And one of the things we were talking about, Julio and I, before we jumped on, is I think especially for millennials is that we grew up, of course, before the days of the internet, where you got your news from the daily newspaper if you paid to get that delivered, or the nightly news on TV, right? And then we grew up, and of course, with the age of the internet, things began to change. And I feel like, we're living now in this world where our perception and our version of reality is becoming so distorted by whatever we tune into, right? Whether or not we're tuning into, not to make it political here, but whether or not we're tuning into CNN versus Fox News, whether or not you're getting your news off of TikTok versus Facebook or Instagram, like
Mhm.
all of these different perspectives are out there. But yet, so many of us get kind of tuned in to the one particular perspective that we've been conditioned to pay the most attention to. When the kind of harsh truth and the real reality of it is that there are multiple truths out there. Two things can be true at the same time, but it's like, which one
Mm.
are you tuning into? So really curious, Julio, to kind of hear your perspective on that conversation too, of how our versions of reality are getting so distorted, and how, especially what you're doing with Shades, can really kind of help to bring all of those perspectives together more.
I think there's a lot there, Peter, and I appreciate the question. I think it's a really interesting question. The point that you made there towards the end about two things can be right at the same time,
Mm,
in a lot of ways represents this sort of, I think, postmodern view of reality that, at least since the late 60s, has slowly become the norm that's taught, certainly in most American universities, increasingly, I think, in a lot of continental European universities, and causing problems as a
yeah,
result. And that embedded within that statement that you made is a very strong, I think, comment on the nature of reality that not everyone would agree with, right? Like, so I think a lot of people are still very much of the mind that there's a right, there's a wrong. You can't
yeah,
have two things that are right at the same time. And I think that that's very much a modernist and pre-modernist standpoint that we've inherited from at least the Enlightenment. Probably most of Western philosophy has had this type of a concept to it. In reality, I think that, and this is something, one of the reasons that the app is primarily geared towards younger people and Z Gen and younger millennials in particular, but I'd say that millennials occupy by definition an almost transitionary state, this transitional state
yeah,
between 20th century Gen Xers who are very much apples off of the tree of their boomer parents and everything that kind of came before that,
yeah,
where this transition in a way into Gen Z. And when we look at it, I think a lot of young people today just take for granted that they themselves contain a multitude of facets to their personality, right? And
mm-hmm,
that in reality, back to the introduction that you made, when we're thinking about our careers, we're necessarily favoring or giving primacy to a certain element of my personality, which
yeah,
is rooted in survival, which is
mm-hmm,
rooted in a traditional type of thought when it comes to how I should be making a living, how I'm going to maintain potentially the legacy that I've inherited from my family, from my parents, from society, whatever it happens to be.
yeah,
And I think that when we look at young people and everything that's really accelerated post pandemic, is that they no longer give as much primacy to that aspect of their personality,
oh,
and that they're
yeah,
much more willing to equalize and elevate my professional and career aspirations versus what's going to actualize me personally. Where are my limitations with respect to my work life balance? What do I want out of my relationship? And they're much more, I think, tapped into these
yeah,
different these different aspects of themselves. And Whitman with the line, I contain multitudes, right? In the 1800s, he's writing about this. I think that it's an intuition that a lot of people have naturally, but that by one way or another we end up losing over the course of our lives, and certainly when we start moving in a more traditional way.
yeah,
One thing that I believe very strongly, and I think that the Shades app is somewhat built upon, is a belief that the 20th century and before was a very disjunctive way of looking at the world. Well, are you this or are you that? Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Are you a feminist or are you a misogynist? Are you this? Are you a man or a woman? Are you
yeah,
gay or straight? Are you this or that? And that by choosing any one of those particular labels or categories, it was a very top down approach where I'm using my belief as to one or two particular issues that sort of shunt me into being a progressive or whatever it happens to
Yeah.
be. And then top down, there's a whole worldview now that I'm expected to go along with based on that decision that I've made. Whereas I think today, young people intuit a much more bottoms up way of looking at the world. Does this
Yeah.
resonate with me? Is this something that makes sense to me? And that
Mm-hmm.
when we were first starting Shades and doing a lot of our early user feedback, it was very interesting how starkly different the views would be from a younger millennial, let's say, to a Gen Xer when it came to what they believed in. And
Yeah.
that Z Gen kids and younger millennials were much more okay living in this state of flux. Excuse me. Today, I've got pink hair. I'm going to wear a Barbie outfit. I'm going to go to work that way. Tomorrow, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
be more goth. The next day, I'm going to wear some gold chains. I'm constantly in the state of play and reinvention. And that when you get to how you're getting your information and how you're consuming information, there really was nothing that met that growing need. And
Yeah.
that in a lot of ways, what we've been forced to have are technical ports or emulations of what we were doing in the late 1900s. So the New York Times, NewYorkTimes.com is really just taking the newspaper and bringing it over to the website. At least that's how it
Yeah.
started. Now they've started breaking into much more of it's less of a news site. It's more of a lifestyle. It's a
Yeah.
cultural, it's a way of being and viewing the world type of app. I no longer consider it, even though they have a newspaper product. The New York Times today, from how you cook, what you wear, what electronics you're using, it's really
Yeah.
framing a way of viewing the world. And that similarly, Shades, I think, is really our our approach to get at this multiplicity of identities, and that the problem is less trying to create non-biased sources of media, but solving the problem of how we connect the dots between multiple sources of biased media so
Yeah.
that through this act of like a bat echolocation, we're able to divine the shape of underlying reality by getting these data points and less esoterically maybe and less philosophically, just as a young person going through the world, I have a better understanding of what an issue is by also not just understanding my point of view or something that I agree with, but also understanding a different point of view that I
Yeah.
don't agree with arms
Mm-hmm.
me to feel much more confident with my understanding of that particular issue, because now you can kind of get the whole picture and feel much more confident or not about the
Yeah.
position that you happen to have adopted.
Yeah. Right. And it's not about that you have to agree with the other perspective. It's just about understanding it because, I think for me, that was one of the big ahas during like those, everybody had their like awakening moment or whatever during COVID. And one of mine was just like, holy shit, like what's really true here? Because what I've deemed to be true is very much based on like this kind of singular perspective of what I've been taught to be true, what I've been conditioned to be true, right? And yeah, when I go out there and if I'm watching one news source and I go out there and watch a different news source and I get that different perspective, I might not agree with it, right? But at least it brings that awareness to be able to expand my perception to then be able to at least consider, well, maybe both things are true, maybe both things are false. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really up to us then. And I think that's where you were talking, it really hit home for me of like, yeah, millennials are kind of that transitionary generation who is really beginning to wake up to say that, oh, yeah, all of the things that my parents taught me from 0 to 7 years old aren't really actually the version of reality that's actually true, right? And I can
Yep.
actually decide to open my perspective up to understanding a more fuller perspective of things.
I think that's
Um,
exactly right. And you're talking about the substance of the issue. I think even before you get to the substance of a particular issue and a particular viewpoint, what we find is that it builds empathy.
yeah,
Even for, it's very easy to dehumanize and to dismiss somebody that doesn't agree with you,
yeah,
particularly when it comes with the boomer baggage and anxiety that we've inherited when it comes to, again, this either or, you're either with me or against me is a different way
yeah,
that you could look at it. And I think that building empathy, and even as a preliminary step, beginning to unravel the news and media to even get you into a frame of mind where, oh, I guess they're not all lunatics, or I don't know everything, instills not just empathy, but a certain amount of humility, and hopefully begins to build some curiosity about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, one of the other pieces too of this that I really love about what you're doing with Shades is, we talk about on the podcast a lot, millennial burnout and burnout in general, but part of that all comes down to the fact that like we are overwhelmed by information overload and stimulus overload coming from, again, all of these different sources, the news, on social media, and so on and so forth. And what I really love about what you're doing is you're still giving those perspectives, but in a way where it doesn't seem as heavy as a lift to be able to take it in, right? It's those short snippets, it's the more visual approach. So talk to the listeners a little bit more about like, yeah, how you kind of came up with this vision of not only providing people with multiple perspectives of understanding, but also doing it in a way that doesn't overload our already overloaded nervous systems.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great, because the origin of the product really, as I said, was my wife during the pandemic, who, as the news junkie, culture vulture of the social circle, was spending hours and hours a day just plugged in and really trying to get as much information as
Yeah.
possible. And people in our social circle knew that and would start asking, "Hey, Sonali, a text message. Hey, Sonali, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about, should I be sending my kids to school? Should they be going in mass? Should they be doing X, Y, or Z?" And it started as these chains of information that Sonali was just, well, here's what the CDC says on X, but I found this article out of Denmark which says Y. And there's
Mm-hmm.
this point of view from Sweden that says that we all should be just going towards herd immunity, whatever it happened to be.
Yeah.
And so it always was this very informal, quick description of what a particular article said, but it was intentionally curated and organized. So I think that there have been lots of approaches to trying to solve the news problem in the 21st century. But
Yeah.
that increasingly what we were finding was that because everyone is kind of going after bots that are simply just summarizing an article, but that don't have a human touch when it comes to organizing it and curating it for understanding, that you would very easily be swiping through Apple News or you name any other app, and you're just faced with a million different versions of the same article. Mariah
Yeah.
Carey, did a show at New Rochester, whatever, and it's just like the same article over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So when we were going after the tone, we knew that we needed to continue this very informal, lowercase, right? It's all lowercase. It should feel, when you go on Shades, hopefully, like you're texting with someone like Sonali, like, hey, tell me what I need to know about girl meals that right now is trending on TikTok, or tell me what I need to know about this thing, what's going on with inflation, what's going on with Ukraine. And it should just be this very short, breezy summary of what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
as it would be if you were texting with your well-informed friend. So I'm glad that you picked up on that and that you like that aspect of the app.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so let's actually, I'm really fascinated to kind of take a step back here with your story, because you kind of have your own little, like, reset story. You came from the world of law, you worked in a law firm, and then kind of got into the world of tech. So take us back a couple of years here, maybe even decades, and talk about like where you got your start, and then how this new idea of coming up with this more positive, user friendly kind of way to get your news. How did you go from working in a law firm to now doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Yeah. So even backing up from there, so I'll say, my parents emigrated to the United States in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
from Central America, from Guatemala. My dad might have a middle school education. I was the first person to, take the SATs and apply to college and to go through that entire system. And so I'd say that as the child of immigrants, I always had a vague sense that I was going to have to be, if I could, be a doctor or a lawyer
Mm,
or an engineer, or to really optimize the potential that had been given to the family by merit of the fact that my parents emigrated to a place that had greater opportunity than what they were leaving behind in
yeah.
Central America. And so I'd say that a lot of my decisions early on in my career were made out of a sense of obligation, out of a sense of tradition, perhaps even guilt
Mm.
with respect to what I ought to be doing. But with one key, I'd say, kind of departure that I had, my parents really wanted me to be a business major when I went to college, and so I registered as a business major. And I was a business major, I think, for less than a week. When you can tell by all these books, I was like, I don't know anything about business. I don't want to know anything about business. What do I really love is that I love books. Shouldn't I be an English major? And so without telling my parents, I just switched my major over to being an English major.
Oh, wow.
And it was probably the most significant decision that I made prior to maybe even getting married or, dating my wife. Because what it did was I spent 4 years having the greatest time of my life. I loved everything that I was doing. I
Yeah.
loved my professors. I loved the material. And I ended up graduating as the valedictorian. I graduated top of my class at UF, one of 3,000 students or whatever, which then was really the only thing that allowed me to be able to get into a law school that I wouldn't have been able to get into otherwise. And so for me, it's always interesting that a big part of my, such as it is, success in my career, I do think is predicated off of this really early departure from the status quo and telling a
Mm.
different narrative and a different story about what the point of college even was, right? And as kind
Yeah.
of a classically oriented person, I did not think that the university system should just be a mill that was preparing me for my career. I
Yeah.
really wanted to get the humanities kind of classic aspect of our liberal arts education. And I
Right.
think that that was my first indication that I might be rewarded by the world and by myself if I kind of went with my passion and went with what I loved as opposed to what I thought that I needed to do. So
Yeah.
um, law school was for me maybe a departure from that. Again, I'm like, okay, I did really well. What am I going to do now? I thought about going to get my PhD, applied to one law school as a kind of deal that I made with myself and with not explicitly with my parents, but I'm going to apply to one law school. And if I get in, I'll go. And if I
Mm-hmm.
don't get in, then I'm not going to go. And so I knew I wanted to be in New York City. I'd heard of Ivy League schools, but had no frame of reference for what that meant outside of Harvard, like a very sheltered upbringing to give you an idea of it. I remember asking one of my professors, is there an Ivy League school in Manhattan? He's like, yeah, it's called Columbia. I'd never heard of Columbia before. I'm like, okay, I'll apply to Columbia. And
Mm.
lucky for me, I ended up getting in. And that was
Wow.
another major moment where I met my now wife. We've been together for 20 years. On the very first day of orientation, really was this amazing element of serendipity, synchronicity, whatever you
Yeah.
want to say. I've been, I think, blessed in my career to have a lot of those moments that could have gone in one direction or another.
Mm-hmm.
Practicing in Manhattan, I hated my life. I felt that I needed to compartmentalize between my personal ethics and my professional life, right?
Mm.
I didn't feel
Yep.
good about the clients that I was representing. I didn't feel good about the arguments that I was expected to make that I knew were not real, but
Yeah.
they could be. They could be. And all we
Mm-hmm.
need to do is sort of muddy the water here, Julio, just enough to kind of make this litigation too expensive, too troublesome, try and introduce a little element of doubt in the mind. It wasn't a fun way of making a living. So I was ready to drop out of the legal profession altogether and
Yeah.
probably go back to school. I wanted to move to California. I'd been living on the East Coast, and I got recruited essentially by a law firm in Menlo Park that had a new client called the Facebook.com.
Oh,
And I
wow.
remember thinking that's the dumbest name for a website that I've ever heard of. What do they do? They explained what it did. I said, look, it sounds really dumb, but it's better by a million times than the PwC accounting litigation that
Yeah.
I've been doing in New York. And the first time that I stepped in the first Facebook offices with spray paint on the walls and people on roller skates and a completely different way of working, I
Yeah.
had no idea that we could do something like this. And it's funny that once I gave into it and got that entrepreneurial bug and started dressing not like a lawyer, wearing t-shirts, all this stuff, I remember somebody from a New York law firm saw me in the way that I was dressed and said, how do you expect people to take you seriously when you're dressed like that? And it just gave me this, I was like, oh man, like I used to think that. And I remember my response to him was, people take me seriously because I have serious things to say. They don't take me seriously because I am wearing a suit or I'm not wearing a suit or whatever other kind of signals that we
Yeah.
think that we need to have in order to cover up for something like that. So I got the entrepreneurial bug, and really the rest of my career was a slow trajectory to get closer and closer to the action and ultimately away from the law. And that culminated in going to a company named GitHub that I joined right at
Hmm.
the Series A, transitioned from being the general counsel eventually to the COO, sold the company to Microsoft in 2018. And GitHub, in and of itself, which was for a lot of its history run as a quasi anarchist, radically non hierarchical, no managers, no what we called coercive management, wherein you weren't allowed to tell anybody what to do. Nobody was allowed
Yeah.
to tell you what to do. We were going to have a conversation about it. We were going to be making decisions largely by consensus. And that GitHub, in that kind of an experimental way, was really the first time that I had an opportunity to institutionalize and operationalize this weirder aspects of what I believed, and
Mm.
that it could be more human, that it could be more communitarian, that just because we were a tech company didn't need to mean that we were antagonistic to our users, that we didn't just need to kind of monetize their lives and
Yeah.
their online presence. I think that there's a lot that can be said about what we've already given up as online citizens. That horse
Yeah.
is out of the stable in a lot of ways. But GitHub was really what cracked open my career, and I had a great 6 year run.
Yeah.
And that afterwards, I think that Shades really what gave me the let's say courage to build a consumer news reference tech app for Gen Z and younger millennials that are notoriously uninterested in reading newspaper articles or what it was. But
Yeah.
it really was, I believed in it. It's a problem that I confront. And that if I'm confronting this issue, chances are that other people out there in the world feel the same way.
Yeah. It's just so interesting to me. It's like, similar to, I think a lot of us can kind of resonate with this idea of like, it's almost like a feedback cycle loop, right? Where it's like when you open up your own perception, because I'll speak for myself, it's like, my family, they have always lived here in the US, right? It's not necessarily an immigration story, but it's more about the fact of the matter of like, the moment that I told my parents that I'm quitting my job and I'm going off and I'm doing my own thing, my entire family just looked at me like I was completely crazy, right? And I did it anyways, and blah blah blah. But it's like it's this whole idea that like sometimes there's something to be said about like when you've got an idea, when you've got a belief for yourself, when you've got a vision for yourself, sometimes it works better to just keep it to yourself. Because the moment that you then go and try to tell somebody else what you're doing, they're going to try to tell you the 10,000 different things to try to talk you out of it, right? And get you to
Yeah.
get back in line, go back to the status quo, get back in the rat race, right? And I think so much of that was really cool about your story is that then kind of transitions into what you're doing today is like you gave yourself permission to kind of open yourself up to a new perspective that was more in line with your own personal values as opposed to the ones that maybe your parents or society taught. And then because of that, now you're creating this app that allows people to kind of give themselves that same permission to open themselves up to a different perspective, a different source of truth and reality. So really,
I think that's right. And in a few different things I think presented by that observation. Number one is that when you're thinking about, you mentioned this point, like sometimes it's better to keep the thing to yourself rather than kind of opening yourself up to some sort of a criticism. I practice yoga. I've been a yogi for a very long time. And I think that in really ways that maybe I don't even understand has sort of permeated throughout my professional life. And I think that for millennials, increasingly, that blurring of the lines, it's very easy to see the negatives of the blurring of the lines between personal and professional time. I'm always
mm,
online, I'm checking email all the time. Now we're working from home, so many of us, and it gets complicated, and we maybe don't have these clean separations that might be better for our mental health or our relationships or whatever it happens to be. But
yeah,
even having a sense of what am I hoping to get out of this conversation? What is my motivation even for raising it with somebody? Because
mm-hmm,
if it's simply looking for some sort of pat on the back and validation, man, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you.
Yeah.
Let me know any way that I
Yep.
can help. You can't control other people's reactions to it. So that if the reason for sharing it is simply to share it, I'm trying to evangelize, I'm trying to get the word out, or even I'm even so excited to just talk about this thing that I'm working on, then it almost doesn't matter what
Yeah.
reaction you get back, right? I don't care. I
Yeah.
achieved my goal, which was simply sharing my vision and sharing this mission. However, if I go into a conversation with a parent or with a significant other, and what I'm expecting is 100% unadulterated validation
Yeah.
and positivity, and I don't get that, well, now all of a sudden you've kind of given control over your own emotional landscape to this other person, and
Yeah.
who knows what you're going to get back. And so I think that we need to be on more solid footing when it comes to what we're relaying to people and why we're doing it, and being a little bit more, I think, self-assured. And
Hmm.
just quickly related to that, the other thing that happens when you're working on something that you believe in and that you're excited about is that even when you're forced to do difficult things, and starting a business, starting your new business is really, really, really hard.
Yeah.
But I'd say that whether it's GitHub or whether it's Shades, there's not a day when I'm not excited to be coming into work and
Yeah.
facing those challenges, because I'm still working on something positive. I'm still working on something that I believe in, and I'm
Yeah.
still working on something that I get joy out of. So it could
Exactly.
entirely be the case that I'm having negative or bad moments throughout my day, throughout my career, throughout my
Yeah.
week. But nevertheless, I'm working on something that I feel fulfillment out of. That's been a really key, I think, insight in my career as well.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I think you're right. That's the huge difference there, right? Is like, you know, people always say to me, even like jumping into like the corporate world to entrepreneurship is like, how do you do it without getting burnt out? And it's like, it's a good stress, right? Stress doesn't always have to be bad. It doesn't have to be the type of stress that's associated with you, going after somebody else's goals and dreams and burning yourself out. But
Yep.
yeah, stress can be a good thing when you're putting it towards something that you actually believe in, as opposed to putting your energy and motivation towards the goals and dreams of somebody else. So big difference
100%.
there.
100%.
Curious to hear from you, Julio, as we begin to kind of get to the end of our episode here. Is number one, why Shades? What's behind the name Shades? And number two, what's next? Like, where is this going? Where do you see this going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So Shades is based off of Shades of Opinion, the different level of nuances and
Yeah.
shades and range of sources that we feature in the app. So that's where that got started. I think that increasingly, and millennials are, I think, increasingly hip to this, and younger people for sure. We see so much today viewing gender across a spectrum, different aspects of our sexuality could be existing across a
Hmm.
spectrum, and in reality I think that we've inherited a way of looking at the world that is these polarities and these dichotomies, when, to the point that you were making early on, in reality it's not that simple, and it's a shade, it's a range, it's a spectrum,
Yeah.
right? So I think the name, we were really trying to capture that. With respect to the future roadmap, the current iteration of Shades, we very much consider to be the first version. This is very much a V1, and we're excited about a lot of stuff that we're doing. And in fact, we just
Hmm.
raised a seed round of capital to start going after improving the app and building out a number of features that we're excited about. So, for instance, right now, the app is very solo player, right? It's not very multiplayer. There's not a lot
Hmm.
that you can do with your social circle, with your contacts. We want to be able to give users the ability to pin things, to start being able to keep track of different points of view on a really granular level, right? So
Mm.
I'm 100%. Let's say I'm pro-choice, right? I'm 100% pro-choice. Why am I pro-choice? And it could be that when you're looking at the tiles on different aspects of that issue, there's a line in this article that we summarized that I really like. Let me pin that. Or maybe I think that I'm a libertarian and I read something on Shades about why somebody's a libertarian or why they might not be a libertarian, and that you can begin to pin and almost create playlists that represent and that are expressive of who
Yeah.
you are in a way that is sufficiently nuanced to meet the needs that the 21st century has for us. I think that if we continue to operate in this mode where we continue to want everything to fit into the very neat boxes, good guys, bad guys, America, Soviet Union. I think we're all kind of still stuck in a very Reaganite 80s way of viewing the world where we assume our media and to be tracking very clear blocks of ideology that are very bright lined and separated from one another. That's not the case
Yeah.
at all, right? And it's such an exciting time, I think, to be existing on the internet. And I think that what Shades really is trying to solve for is that, again, our current media services have not caught up to that reality that has
Yeah.
been exposed more than anything by the internet, and that we're still just trying to read one newspaper in order to get that. That no longer is the case, and it needn't be the case when we now have the technology and we have all these opinions that exist online. Let's create an app, which is Shades, that allows us to get visibility into all of that so that we can actually benefit from the heterogeneity and diversity that the internet has made possible to see. Because I do think that that's always existed, right, for humanity. Like I was talking yesterday where all the fantasy books that I grew up reading were always from the perspective of the would-be hero, right? It's only a matter of time before this person is going to recognize that they're the hero and that they've got the magic to solve the problems. It's
Yeah.
always from the point of view of the nobility. It's always from the point of view of like this royal family that happens to have the
Uh-huh.
magic sword. All that whole time there were stories that could have been told about the serfs and the village people and all this kind of stuff. And that's what we get today, right? We're able to get visibility into all of us, and we're not benefiting from that equalization. And what's interesting is that us as millennials remember what it was like, most of us,
Exactly.
in the
Yeah.
90s when the internet was first coming into being, and the
Hmm.
level of excitement, not just excitement about what was possible, but excitement about what it was going to do for the world. I'm creating
Yeah.
my homepage, like, welcome to my homepage, under construction, little animated GIF, and talking
Uh-huh.
about myself and bringing the world together. It really did feel like it was going to bring the world together. But
Yeah.
because the technical platforms, its algorithms, and importantly, our monetization strategies are and have become what they are, we've become very cynical about
Yeah.
the internet. We've become very cynical about the potential to benefit society. If anything, I'd say that if we were doing polls, most people would say that the internet today is potentially providing a net neutral in their lives and is kind of a
Hmm.
distraction as opposed to something that is actually benefiting from us. And I'd say that Shades, at the end of the day, is an attempt by myself and my co-founders to try and get back to a more optimistic, positive view of what the internet is. And I
Yeah.
don't believe that Wikipedia represents the end of history. I don't believe that these tools can't be improved upon, and
Yeah.
that we really, what we're in the need for, and what I hope Shades represents, is a paradigm shift in
Hmm.
how we get informed on issues. That it's no longer the best way to just read a single source. Let me read multiple sources so that I can have a more empathetic human conversation or
Yeah.
approach that's more sophisticated without being dogmatic or elitist.
Yeah. I mean, I think it gives back the option of choice, right? It gives back the option for you to be able to choose what you tune into and pay attention to. And when you have more choice in your life, then you have a hell of a lot more control. And when you
Yeah.
have more control, you have a heck of a lot more freedom, and the
Yep.
ability to respond as opposed to react, right?
I
And
believe that more information is always better than less
yeah,
information in my mind.
exactly. Whew, well, what you're doing is, I'm sure, I mean, it's incredibly powerful already, and very excited to kind of see where this goes because, I mean, I'm just, my head is spinning right now in terms of the potential of this kind of thing of like bridging the gap between I don't know what I don't know
Yep.
and at least getting them to be able to say, okay, at least I know what I don't know and I can
Yep.
take action or I cannot take action, right?
Yep.
Um, so yeah, really powerful stuff. Julio, tell everybody a little bit more about where they can find out more information and learn more about the app.
Sure. The Play Store or on the Apple App Store, you just search Shades or Shades News and you'll find us. You can go to shades.news on the internet. We've got a popular TikTok account, which is Shades with four S's at the front and four S's at the end. And if any of your listeners are interested in finding out more or just speaking, they're free to email me at shades.news. Julio at shades.news. Happy to talk to anybody that's interested in the mission and what we're trying to accomplish.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to post that with the podcast episode. But thank you again for coming on and not only sharing your story, but sharing the power of, like you mentioned, the ability to be able to, create a new perspective for yourself and open up your level of focus to be able to take in, a different version of reality. I think is really what it comes down to. It's like, yes, we can talk about it being as a news app, but I think furthermore, it's like we're talking about like creating a different perception of reality for yourself.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other level. So thanks again, Julio. Really appreciate your time on the Millennial Reset today.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And thank you all again for tuning in to another episode. Be sure to share out far and wide with your besties so we can continue to spread the word. And be sure to check out the website, www.themillennialreset.com, to subscribe to the podcast and learn more about upcoming events. We'll see you next time on the Millennial Reset. Hey besties, if you're one of the millions of millennials feeling stuck in a constant state of stress and burnout, then number one, you're not alone. And number two, there is a way out. Be sure to check out www.themillennialreset.com for free online workshops, or you can become a member and join a community of support to learn a better way out of burnout.